Good evening and welcome to Accessible Globe TV. Tonight has been a delicate subject for me. It's one I've wanted to do for a while, which is what it's like if you have found out you're having a child with a disability and how you progress through life with them. The other day I was listening to a TED Talk with Dr. Lisa Thornton, and she was discussing what it was like for parents who had children with disabilities, some of the mistakes they made, some of the way they felt and how they navigated life with them. And I thought, I've often wondered some of these questions. Perhaps I can talk to someone. Friends of mine, Rod and Leanne Schultz, have a wonderful son, Anthony. He has cerebral palsy, he's profoundly deaf, and he has epilepsy. And he's just actually a joy to be around. And I thought I'd talk to Rod and Leanne about what it's like living and bringing up and just being a part of Anthony's life. Let's have a listen to what they had to say. So the first question is simple. What were your first reactions when you found out that Anthony wasn't as you probably expected? And I want to know from both of you. Sorry, Rod. You can go first, Leanne.
Well, it wasn't really a sudden knowledge. Anthony's disabilities weren't so obvious right from day one.
Right.
Although, because he's a second child, we had parental instinct that things weren't quite right, but we didn't quite know the what.
Okay.
So there were a couple of moments in time when it became obvious. And at first, I have to say that and this is being really very honest, my first reaction was one of shame. How can we produce a child who isn't quite right? And I remember thinking, and I hope this isn't offensive to anyone, but you asked, so you have to try and be honest in a reaction, because we're all human, and so our reactions often are not the ones we'd like them to be when we first find out shocking news. And so I guess there was a part of me that felt that I could cope with a person with a physical disability, but I wasn't quite sure what I'd do with a person with an intellectual impairment. But of course, he was our beautiful son, and we loved him from the moment he was born. And so eventually, well, you don't even think about it. You really don't. There's a shock, there's a moment of shock when it becomes a reality, but he's still my beautiful boy.
Were you guilty? Did you feel guilt?
Oh, of course, there's always been guilt.
Can you share at all why you would feel guilt? Is that possible or not?
I guess there's always a question that you ask yourself, did I do something that caused this? And part of Anthony's explanation for his disability is that he was affected by a virus during pregnancy. And so there's that element of, well, what if and could I?
What if I stayed home, or what if I...
Yes. And then he had a very rapid arrival in the world. And so there was this concern from me that I may have done something to hurry his birth up, that perhaps that was the cause. So, yes.
We always find ways to make it our fault, don't we?
Yes.
Always.
Yes, but I came to terms with that many years ago, and of course understand that it isn't my fault, and I refuse to carry guilt, because it isn't mine to carry, and I don't own it.
We'll get into it later, but if it hadn't have happened, we wouldn't have the beautiful person that Anthony is now.
That's right.
But that's another story.
And I wouldn't be the person that I am today either.
That's what we're going to talk about today. Rod, what about you when you first realised that Anthony was not as expected? That's the best way I can put it.
Yeah, that's a realistic way of presenting it. Unlike Leanne, I didn't feel any guilt or anything like that. I've always been a person who looks at things philosophically. I had initially my belief system such that God doesn't produce any junk, so it's a person of value to start with, and I guess my mind and emotions went to what do I need to know to correct what's in front of me and to get the best out of our child.
Correct or help?
It's a combination of both. To help, I guess, is one way. I guess it's digging into the understanding the whys and wherefores. So you then needed, I see correction as a process where you find out what the cause is and then you work at ways of remediation through it. Because at that stage, initially we were looking at something that was physical, that needed correction. And I see that as correction, like, to me it was a biomechanical thing that we initially had to look at. Yep, the body wasn't working right, the normal things weren't. So what could we do to supplement what the body wasn't doing, to develop the strength, flexibility and all those things? Because the biggest initial challenge was for him to be able to support his own head. So that meant developing sufficient neck muscles, shoulder muscles and all of that. So that he could
survival first.
Yeah, so that he could hold his head, which had other implications for feeding, all sorts of other things.
Yep.
Sitting.
Would you say that when you realise that a son or a daughter are probably not going to be what you had hoped for or expected at the time, would you say there's a period of grieving to let go of that expectation?
Probably, I'll answer so you can follow up. Initially, I would say no. To me, that if I had to take a point in time where the grief was extremely obvious when we knew for sure that he was deaf. Up until that point, you would say it was in the background. I think you naturally grieve anyway, but it certainly wasn't prominent.
Was it a grief though I guess the point I'm getting to, and it's an interesting one for me, do you grieve the loss of the child that would have been?
No.
Okay, and you didn't either, Leanne?
No.
No,
But what you do grieve is the loss of that child's future.
Yes.
And for us, it was fairly tangible, or for me as a mother, because we had a very close friends and we were pregnant at the same time and our babies were due within days and born within days. Their child was born without a disability and ours was born with a disability. So every milestone that would normally be reached, this little girl was reaching and my little boy wasn't.
How did you feel about that?
There was always an element of grief. There was a joy that little girl was doing what she
So grief
did.
but not jealousy.
No jealousy, no, because I had a beautiful, gorgeous little boy.
So in a sense you did grieve what wasn't.
Yes.
Even though you can come to love or already loved what is.
Accept and love who you have, but definitely a grief for a picture in your head of what life might have been.
That's what I'm saying. Grief for that only.
But the reality is that we gained so much more than what we lost. So I no longer grieve that.
Would you agree that the quicker that a parent who has a child that I wish I had a better phrase for it, but it has not turned out as expected or gone a different way or whatever, would you agree that the quicker the parents can accept that, the easier it is on the child?
Oh, yes, once the parents have accepted it, definitely.
Why the smile, right?
I immediately think of some examples.
Oh, what?
I can think of some immediate examples of
Please.
Well, particularly as I'm looking down a few years, at this stage we didn't know Anthony was, we suspected he was hard of hearing, but certainly not deaf. And I'm thinking of the times when he was disobedient and wasn't quite doing the right thing because he was heading the other way, and he wasn't listening to me, and he got a consequence for that.
So he got a consequence for ignoring you when he actually wasn't.
He didn't have a clue what I was saying. Totally deaf. So there are quite a few times when the sooner I realised he was totally deaf and didn't get any of that he didn't suffer the consequences he had been receiving on a
Poor Anthony.
that he didn't deserve.
And it's great though, isn't it, that you can laugh about.
Yeah.
You're not carrying guilt for it. It was not done on purpose.
No.
And he doesn't even remember, probably.
No,
Oh, no.
the old no. Coming back to your grief bit, I'd say from the time that Anthony was still quite young, I'd say probably 6 or 7, the grief component hasn't really been there whatsoever, because Anthony very quickly showed that he could achieve things that most other adults couldn't.
Yes.
He could turn and change people's attitudes and interactions with other people that many people have tried before and failed, and Anthony had success.
Can you give me an example of that? I know it's difficult, but
You think?
or either of you? Because I know it's true.
But
One fairly recent one. So he's a grown man with an intellectual impairment, but he's very happy and outgoing. And he and a support worker were on a farm stay holiday, just a very couple of nights. Or actually, I think they did about 5 nights. So he'd been there at this farm stay for a couple of days, and it was a place where a lot of tourists, overseas tourists, also came. It was here in Queensland. And Anthony had got the run of the place and been accepted. He was allowed into the preparation kitchen where nobody else was, because Anthony didn't know that there were boundaries. So he just went in to help in the kitchen. But as the support worker told us, there arrived on one of the days after Anthony had been there for a little while, a very attractive young female French lady. And she arrived and she wasn't at all sure how to take this grown adult man. He's quite handsome, but she wasn't too sure because he wasn't behaving in ways that people normally do. And so she was quite standoffish. But as the support worker explained...
Nobody can be standoffish with Anthony for long, by the way. But go on. Yeah.
That's the one. And so that's exactly what happened. He just, because he takes people at face value, and he saw this very nice lady and he tried to interact with her in the ways only Anthony can, and it didn't take very long at all before she was eating out of his hand, and they became great mates in that period of time because he was able to change an attitude from her. Perhaps she'd never come across a person with an intellectual impairment before who couldn't speak and hear what she was saying. He does an awful lot of communicating for someone who can't speak or hear, doesn't he? A lot of communicating, that's different from speech. But he turned her attitude around entirely in a very short space of time. And he's been doing that forever, hasn't he, Rod?
yes. And particularly, well, even within our church, you have people who have set traditions. Well, Anthony has certainly broken some of those down because...
I love Anthony at church because when everything's quite serious, and I've just about had enough of the seriousness, you'll hear Anthony have a bit of a laugh, and I'll go, oh, thank you, Anthony, I love you so much. It's just a little bit of a tension breaker there.
Yes.
And he's extremely observant.
He is.
And that's a skill which he's had to develop, and he uses that to his advantage quite often.
Now, there's another smile. Do you saying that he can learn how to manipulate just a bit, right?
Just a little bit, yes. And he can...
Just a quick aside, is that hereditary, Leanne?
Oh, no.
Oh, good answer. Good answer. That's why this might look big in these genes. Very good answer. But no, he can, can't he? He can control the situation that he's in very well, all jokes aside. I mean, I didn't even realise in the beginning that he was hearing impaired for some weeks, and yet he always greeted me, he always gave me either well, the boys sort of get a high five, but somehow or other the women seem to get a hug.
Yes.
He seems to have all that worked out, I think. But anyway,
Down to fine art, yes.
Now, I think he does. Now, just before we get off that sort of grieving period, so we've got sort of a no from you, Rod, and sort of a yes kind of from Leanne, that there was some grief as you went along. I believe that grieving process continues, perhaps not as intensely, but would you say it continues as he gets older and you see things that he misses out on and things like that, or even though he's got other things?
To some degree, but I think you learn to adjust to that because he is who he is and he's just Anthony. So no, I don't know that grieving is quite the same. There have certainly been some times of grieving because when he was able to move out of home, it took me a very long time, although there was a sense of relief to some degree, but there was also a grief that he was no longer under our roof. And so there was that kind of grieving too, and I used to hear him when he wasn't actually there, but I used to hear because I'd become so trained to my perception of what he was doing was with my ears. So I would listen all the time. So there was that sense of trying to find who I was again after he moved out of home. And I see some of that as a period of grief.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd just like to step back a little bit because Rod mentioned about when we found out that he was deaf, and so he was 6 when we had that confirmed, and I'd taken him to Brisbane for an audio brainstem response test because the normal tests done for children with hearing impairments or to test children's hearing weren't working. They weren't giving clarity because of his intellectual impairment, and it was hard to tell. So we had this audio brainstem response test which measures the responses of the brain rather than the child themselves having to give a response to a sound. And so they'd had to sedate Anthony. He wasn't asleep, but he'd been sedated. And I held him in my arms while they did this test. And at the end of the test, the audiologist came in. And although I'd lived with him for 6 years and had a fair idea that he...
We kept trying to tell everybody he was deaf, but everybody kept saying, oh, no, he can hear something.
They did.
So we've had kind of 4 or 5 years of 4 years of that where we've been more or less told, no, you can hear something. We keep saying, well, we don't think he can, but...
Okay.
But parent instincts are pretty good, and
They are pretty good, aren't
I
they?
think parent instincts should be listened to more.
And the person themselves instinct
Yes.
if they can make it across too.
Yes.
So we've talked about how it was. One of the things that worries me is what's it like having a child with a disability and thinking, all right, I've been there for them now. What's going to happen when I pass away?
Well, that's where you do the planning in advance. And we as a couple actively sought to plan for Anthony's future. We didn't know what it looked like, but we hoped that he would have an opportunity to live independently of us, and we started actively working towards that from a very young age. And we did that by encouraging respite care, and respite care was extraordinarily painful. There was a huge amount of grief involved in leaving a crying child behind with strangers, not knowing whether they would care for him.
Whether they look after him.
Correctly.
Yeah.
And when you came back and found out that he'd spent a weekend and he hadn't allowed anyone to change his pants and he'd stayed in the same smelly, wet clothes for the whole
Because that's
weekend.
about his dignity, isn't it?
And yes, and he kept his suitcase at the door because he didn't want to be there. And you come back and that's what you're told. It hurt as parents to do that.
But you found ways around that
Well,
now.
we did it because we believed it was important for his long-term future. We felt it was important that he learn that other people would need to care for him. He was never going to be able to care completely for himself. So we knew that that was part of his education, that he had to learn that people other than mum and dad could do those things. And so we actively sought to only leave him in situations that we had a trust of the people. Even if he didn't, we made sure that they were people that we could trust, and that we always sought out high quality care, so that even though as a little boy he was unhappy for that period of time, we justified it because we knew that in the longer term, in the whole of his life, that one night of unhappiness when he knew he was loved and very much wanted, that balanced against the bigger picture was it was for his long-term good that we did it.
You've looked across a couple of times, Rod. What are you thinking?
Anthony wouldn't have been able to know that we would come back for him unless he'd experienced being left. And that's with a lot of the things we've put him through, which have been extremely unpleasant for him.
And us.
And us, more so for my wife, was there was a net gain long term. And whether that be the only reason he's walking is because he had an extremely intensive physiotherapy session every day for years. None of it was comfortable or enjoyable. So he put that up for years. That's why I said his capacity to handle what's in front of him is huge, because he's developed the perseverance. The other thing is, and I believe this is for all people, you'll probably concur with this with disability, people with disability are the biggest risk takers on the planet.
Yes.
And we treat them as if they're fragile, and yet they take the biggest risks. They survive all these things, and therefore we disrespect them so often by not giving them the credit that they deserve.
I had wonderful parents who were very protective, incredibly overprotective. But that was probably better than being underprotective. But still, overprotectivity, if you like, can cause a lot of worry. But yeah, it's not easy to find that balance, is it?
No, and you will get as much wrong as you get right, but you don't find out unless you give it a go.
And you can never really know. Just very quick, I haven't had many examples of me, but Mum and Dad used to give me to a physiotherapist in the Royal Children's Hospital, and Mum would leave. And if I cried, she'd put me in a cupboard and lock me in until I stopped. Told me it was the naughty room. So, that was traumatic. And it's still, to this day, it's traumatic. But the thing is, if you find good care, which you've done, the difference, the independence that comes when they're not with you,
Yes.
when they realise that there's a life outside of Mum and Dad, is freeing for them as much as it is for you.
And they learn a whole lot more out of your care than they do in your care when they reach in those ages of maturity, because like all children, when they leave the nest, they develop a whole set of skills which they never did because Mum and Dad filled in for them.
Yeah.
So same with Anthony, when he left home, there are a whole lot of things that he filled in that because Mum and Dad actually filled in those gaps. And I think that's one of the things where parents who have a child with disability need to realise that, as well as being the facilitator of so much of their development, they can also be the hinderer of further development.
Yes.
At a certain stage of maturity.
They can't live their children's lives. They can only help them live their own.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they learn how to get into the kitchen at the thing where they go away for the weekend and manipulate the lady, right?
That's the one.
That we talked about just before. Once you let go of what you originally thought that child would be, can you rejoice and enjoy in their achievements?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I can recognise the beautiful personality of my son. I can recognise how much he's taught me. I can recognise the value of his life for us and for so many people whose lives he's touched. And I just, there's way more rejoicing than grief now because of who he is.
And Rod? I'm just going backwards and forwards, but I want to get your take on that.
His effect has been exponential with me because he trained me in a set of skills that I needed to help him, and with his extra 2 bobs worth of pointing me in the right direction from time to time, I have a set of skills which I then used in my profession, which was far greater than any professional development could have given me. So if you then look at the people and children I've been able to help over the decades because of his training of me, and also my capacity to help parents along the way, because I also understood where they came with my parent hat on as well as my educator hat on. So I think, he has, as far as value goes.
Who's taught who the most?
Anthony has taught me far more than I've taught him by a long way.
Really?
I'm not even close, And for all the things that he's taught me,
Just one quick one on the religious side, because I will embrace it. You mentioned in the beginning that God doesn't produce rubbish, which I thought was a very direct way, because he's certainly not that. How did you feel any, and do you, okay, I believe you didn't feel any anger towards God at all. But other people may not have the faith you have. So would you have any advice for those people in how to look at something like this? What would your advice be to them if they've just had a child that is not exactly how they expected them to be?
Okay, I would say this child will bring many challenges. However, the rewards of facing those challenges and working through them means that, one, you will be a better person for it, and two, you'll be surprised at what your child has to contribute to society.
Were you surprised, Leanne, in what eventually became or has become of Anthony and what he brought in? I mean, you didn't know what it would be like in the beginning. Have you been surprised by things?
Oh, always.
Yeah, what
But
kind
I
of
think
things?
life is always surprising, and I just think you've got to appreciate in front of you instead of always looking to what could have been. And when Anthony was still very young, and I went to a seminar, and one of the things that meant something to me was a little analogy that was given that sort of touched my heart, and it was along the lines of I was off on a trip and I packed my bags and I was going to Holland, and I was expecting to see windmills, and I was going to see all the dikes, and that's what I wanted. That's what I was planning. Hopped on the plane, and the plane got diverted, and I landed in Paris instead of in Amsterdam. And I didn't see windmills, but I saw the Eiffel Tower and I saw the Arc de Triomphe. So it wasn't what I'd expected, but Paris was equally beautiful for its own reason. And that touched me because that's really been a bit of a picture of how I see our life with Anthony. No, I wasn't expecting to have a child with disability, but I've embraced and accepted and enjoyed the journey with this child who is not what we expected, but it's been a beautiful journey anyway.
Rod, I've seen you and Anthony be father and son, and you always portray this I've got a thick skin, tough guy thing that I don't buy for a second, not even 1 second. Can you tell me just one time when you've been surprised by Anthony and just gone, wow?
One time?
Just pick one. We can do more later.
Okay, I'll give you one which is in one way insignificant, but it was potentially traumatic and dramatic, in that I'd taken him to see my boss. For some reason I was visiting his house, and he had a good friend like you've got, an Alsatian, and we got in the gate and he just came tearing around at us and went straight for Anthony. And Anthony just put his hand up and grabbed the dog by the nostrils and brought it down to heel in front of him. And the dog yelped and carried on, and then Anthony just let him go and he whipped and ran off. Now, I was panicking. I was looking for the worst and whatever. Anthony had it totally in control. And it should have been physically impossible to do what he did, because he's, as I said, his fine motor manipulation is non-existent. And yet he managed to grab this dog in exactly the right place that was attempting to bite him. He manages to not get hurt whatsoever and take total control. So that's just one of the minor little things where...
I just had a call from my postman and he wants to know if Anthony can come and work with him. But anyway, look, thank you very much, both of you, for being so blunt and honest. We may do this again sometime if it's all right. It's been really fun for me. I know it's not easy always to talk about these things, but you've been really blunt and honest, and we appreciate it, and I'm sure it'll be helpful for people that perhaps have just have a newly acquired child with some surprises in store. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rod.
Thanks, Rod.
Well, I'd like to thank Rod and Leanne for being so upfront, so candid, so honest in that interview. It was not that easy for them, and we're really grateful for what they did. We'll be doing a few more programs like that in the future. Let's say thank you to some of the people that have helped us along our way. There we go. We've got Simple Solutions, who are an NDIS provider and NDIS trainer, and I know they provide some of the care for Anthony, and they love him very, very much indeed. We've got Hello World Travel in Harvey Bay, who take the bookings for our trips overseas. We'll be doing a Thailand and Philippine one very soon. We've got Totally Mobile, who do all the scooters and things. We've got AOMI, who do automatic housing, like opening doors and so on. Special thanks to the NDIS, because their support in my life makes me be able to do the things that we're doing. What else can I say? Please subscribe. Thank you, Carl. I'll be heading off to the Philippines in about a month and a half, and we'll be doing some filming over there. And I'll be getting this tooth fixed that has just broken in my mouth. There'll be 2 of them. So that's pretty, that's good timing, because it'll be a lot cheaper over there. Thank you very much for joining us today. We hope it will be of some help to some people, anyone who might have had a newly born son or daughter with a disability. We hope it can be helpful, and we hope that it was interesting for all of you. We'll be back in a few days with something different. Let's have a quick look at Anthony and Leanne and Rod, and we'll see you in a couple of days.